about you. My wife was a competitive horse person in college.
That's cool, Brian. Yeah, well, I'm not one, but my daughters are, so.
Well, welcome everyone to the call. We're going to get started in just a minute. It looks like we're at about 65 folks, and I think we're anticipating something around somewhere between there and 80. So we'll just give it a second, and we'll get started. If you want to, we'll give you this prompt officially again in a minute. But if you want to put your name and little, sentence, you might do like the name, the place you work, where you consider home to be, and if you want like a little, phrase or something about how you're doing, and toss that in the chat, and that'll give us a sense. We won't take the time to go around and do full introductions, but that'll give us a feeling about who's on the call, if you want to engage there. And I think we'll go ahead and officially get started, but feel free to do that way go. So welcome again. My name's Scott Nine, and I serve as the assistant superintendent. Hello, can you hear me? I think our team trying to handle background noise muted everyone. So maybe someone in the chat or someone on my team can wave at me that you can hear me now. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Shauna. So I'm the assistant superintendent for the Office of Education, Innovation, and Improvement. We're glad to have you with us, and hopefully you're in the right place if what you came for was a learning session. This is not like an official co-development session. It's not a green light. The SIA is going forward as much as we would love news about the budget. It's really a session that's about honoring the work that was done over the last year, and to try to see if there's valuable things about that work, about the review work that's been happening at the agency, the learning that you all have done out in community and in your teams and schools and districts, and if there's anything of that that's got value for what's unfolding in the year ahead. And it's a little bit of an experiment to see what we could find out about that. So we might end this meeting and you might tell us all, that's not a good use of time and we won't do more of them, or people might end the call thinking, that was helpful and we want to do more of that kind of thing, in which case we might do more of it as we await for budget decisions and other things that would kind of move us kind of more structurally forward. So I'm happy to offer a little welcome and introduction, and then we'll turn it over to the team to walk through a lot of the content, and I'll stay on and be available for part of the question and answer at the end. Also really welcome folks to use the chat throughout the time as a place to share prompts, ideas, learning. Please don't hesitate there. We'll track and respond feedback and engage along the way. And as I mentioned before, and a couple folks have started to do that, if you'll take a minute to go ahead and use that chat box, and if you're not familiar with Zoom too much, although I think everyone is now, kind of bottom of your screen, it should pop up. If you'll share an introduction of yourself, your name, where you work, location, and any kind of little message you want to just give us a sense who's on the call. That'll help us keep getting a sense, and it looks like most of you have, but please feel free to do that. And then Chris, if you'll move us to the next slide. So here's our agenda. I'm going to just talk about, introduce some kind of quick, kind of lean into norms and covering some of the goals of our time. Shpresa Halimi, Dr. Shpresa Halimi is gonna take you through a little kind of refresh overview. We know there's been a few things that have been happening since we've had any real structured conversation about the SIA evaluation framework and the growth targets and progress markers. So you get a little walkthrough of that along with a couple of ESD leaders. And we'll talk about, we'll also introduce kind of where we're at on the development of progress markers. And then Tim Boyd's going to lead a team to kind of talk about some of the actual examples and trends and lessons that we've learned from the review of growth targets and what we saw in those submissions, and kind of workshop and talk out loud about some of those things. Share some strong examples and counter examples. And then we'll have a good solid 20 minutes for kind of open Q&A and workshop at the end of our time. So that's kind of the outline of our agenda. Any questions on the agenda, feel free to toss them in the chat now. And then I've said most of this in terms of the goals, but really is to kind of honor and glean the work, try to really spot some patterns and trends and lessons, make space to really take in what you're learning. So it's not just about what we're learning or thinking about at ODE, but really wanting to figure out what's actually alive or helpful or useful to you now. Keep thinking about the development of this evaluation framework. And there are some folks on who are from school districts who maybe waited and didn't do draft growth targets and wanted to kind of see what other people are doing. So it's a chance for folks in that situation to also just kind of track in and learn more about how other folks approached it and where they are now, and where that might inform your practice going forward, kind of irrespective of SIA funding or not. So those are our kind of big goals for the time. And then Chris, if you'll go ahead and move to the next one. Some of these may be familiar to you, but we find it helpful not to necessarily take the time for a group of this size to try to dig in and reach kind of deep dialogue agreements, but really just invite you to kind of practice with these to help us have a rich learning space. So the first protocol is that trust is earned, and let's attempt to move in conversation like we've got some years working together behind us. So we know it takes time to earn trust, and we don't want to pretend that we have it or that people on the call have it with each other. But if we can kind of lean into the kind of conversation where we're a little more sleeves rolled up and trust that we can hold a little bit more attention, we can get farther in the conversation. We think that will bring more value to it. Along those same lines, we want to engage tension and disagreement. There's a lot of richness in having different ideas and opinions. And then the practice of, there's a different version of that, which is where it gets kind of we kind of indulge in the drama side of the conflict. And so this is a practice in our office as well. It's like kind of engage the tension, don't indulge the drama. Share space. That can come from a lot of different perspectives. So that could be about dynamics between, like racial dynamics between white folks taking more space or color. It could be gender dynamics and men. It can also just be as simple as some people process really verbally and are very quick processors, and other people might take time and want to kind of slow down. There's actually a lot of wisdom in all of those spaces, and so just taking the time to catch those patterns and kind of share space well and get the richness of everyone's attention and input from the call. And one of the reasons that we use the chat space is it allows for some learning and things to show up that don't just come out in the out loud verbal part. Probably not an issue for this conversation, but dialogue, you know, we're not selling. We want to converse but not pitch. So you know, folks might have products or vendors or ideas of things that they think are relevant to these things. We want to kind of stay away from that and be really in the dialogue space. Assume best intent, but intend to impact when we do get caught up in some conundrums. You know, particularly talking about the focal student groups and dynamics, we can kind of trip up. There can be some dynamics around language where we're uncomfortable, and we want to be able to address those things and pay attention to any impact. And then lastly, like this is not pay attention like a scolding, pay attention. It's like an invitation to bring your awareness to the call. So we like to think about it like everyone on the group's the facilitator. And if we can all take time to kind of notice each other, notice our process, we also think we could have a better conversation. So really noting all of those things in terms of just how we want to move forward. So we'll hope that you'll feel like you can take those in and practice kind of into them for today, and we'll go from there. And next slide, please, Chris. Thank you. So here's where I hand it off to Shpresa. Also, a little, Shpresa brings with her a great background in evaluation frameworks and methodologies and thinking deeply about systems and capacities. And so she's going to kind of just give us a little bit of a refresh of this framework. And so without further ado, I'm going to pass it off to you. So welcome, Shpresa. Shpresa, you might be on mute.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you, Scott, for the nice introduction. I'm Shpresa Halimi and I lead the grant management and monitoring unit for the student investment account. So today's session, I hope it's not redundant. It's the first part, it's about an overview or refreshing the memory about the common and customized monitoring and evaluation framework that was introduced as part of the December 2019 guidance. So I'll provide a short summary of the framework, and we'll continue with introduction of the initial or draft progress markers, and we'll have two colleagues from two ESDs joining me for that portion, and I will introduce them when we get to that point. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned in the December 2019 guidance, ODE introduced a common and customized monitoring and evaluation framework. The Student Success Act requires the development of longitudinal performance growth targets as accountability measures to provide a picture of key points of student progress and growth. The legislation identified 5 common metrics that are listed, and I'll take it you are familiar with those, you have seen them before, but 4-year graduation, 5-year completion, 3rd grade reading, 9th grade on track, and regular attenders. So each, for the school districts that applied for SIA funding, were encouraged to develop draft longitudinal performance growth targets and submit them along with their SIA plans. And many school districts did that, and we do appreciate all the hard work that went into developing not only the SIA plans, but also the draft longitudinal performance growth targets. Along with, for each of these common metrics, we also introduced what are known as progress markers and optional local metrics. Next slide, please. So I'll provide a short overview of each of these components. So for longitudinal performance growth targets, what are they? Basically, they are based on data which is available for longitudinal analysis, and use overall rates for districts and gaps in disaggregated rates, and include the common metrics and any locally defined metrics included in the applicant's SIA plan. This is the next slide, basically provides the kind of the framework that we introduced in the guidance that school districts could use, more of a template to include their stretch targets, baseline targets, and gap closing targets. Next slide, please. So for each of the common metrics, ODE also introduced progress markers, and maybe this is a newer concept that it's still evolving, but as a short summary, what are progress markers? Progress markers are a set of indicators that identify the kinds of changes we would expect and like to see in policies, practices, and approaches over the next 3 years. that we think would lead to applicants reaching their longitudinal performance growth targets. Progress markers, when we introduced progress markers, we also introduced two types of progress markers: the expect to see category of progress markers, and then would like to see. Progress markers, expect to see progress markers, represent initial, easy to achieve changes that indicate a recognition of and commitment to SIA plan goals, whereas would like to see progress markers represent more of a longer term changes, and it indicate more active learning and engagement. During our progress markers development work, we also realized that there was another category of progress markers that we had not thought of initially, but we realized that it was important to have it as a separate category, not under the 5 common metrics, but as a 6th category, if you will. And we called it enabling conditions. And my colleagues, when we introduce the document, will probably share a little bit more about it, but enabling conditions basically are changes that seem to be essential for growth toward each of the common metrics. For example, equity lens is in place, adopted, and woven through all policies, procedures, and practices. So this, I think, it's where innovation sits. So I would consider this as a kind of an innovation and addition to the progress markers framework that it was developed based on an approach that it's called outcome mapping. And so we used that approach to develop the progress markers, but also through collaboration and continuous conversations, decided to develop also the category of enabling conditions. Next slide, please. We also introduced the concept of optional local metrics, and we encouraged all the applicants to put forward optional local metrics that may more accurately align to the particular strategies, activities, and investments outlined in their SIA plans. This is just kind of a visual of progress markers, longitudinal performance growth targets, and optional local metrics. Next slide, please. So a few notes about this approach. We are at a different kind of point in time now compared to 6 months ago. Many things have evolved and have changed, but we also realize that this framework is flexible enough that allows for the districts to respond to the variances. It's a framework that can be adjusted, can modified, can be further developed and adopted, not just for the SIA context, but we would love to see school districts make use of this framework to inform decision-making processes in other important initiatives, such as reopening of the schools for the 2021 school year, school improvement plans, and other initiatives that they will be taking on over time. Next slide, please. So today we are gonna launch the draft or initial progress markers. In a couple of like slide 16 or 17, you will see a link to the full document. We don't have the time to go over every single page in the document, but I will invite all of you to take a look. We don't expect that you will be able to digest all that information in this workshop. But if there are, if there is immediate feedback or reaction, please use the chat feature to provide your feedback. Otherwise, we also have included a link to a form where you can continue to provide feedback as you get more familiar with the document and the progress markers. To help launch the progress markers, we have invited two ESD liaisons, Sue Wilson and Angie Ariola. They are both on the call, and they will share their experiences from participating into the progress markers development process and share some thought and ideas on how do they see this framework being used in different contexts and to inform the development of different initiatives. Next slide, please. So the next slide basically summarizes the process that we went through as we were developing the progress markers. We started the development of progress markers pre-COVID. So this work took place in March and April. So the caveat here is that moving forward, we might not have the same school year that we had envisioned at the time of developing the progress markers. So it will be very important for us to get the feedback from all of you on whether the progress markers are still relevant. Do they resonate with you? Do you suggest any modifications or adjustments as that we make as we move forward? But we do realize that this was, as I mentioned, pre-COVID work, but very appreciative of all the efforts that went into this process. This was a little bit separate from the process of developing longitudinal performance growth targets, even though they're linked. And my colleagues will speak to that process, how it unfolded and what did we do at several stages into the process. Next slide, please. So here it's where I would invite the two ESD liaisons, Sue and Angie, to share their experiences of developing the progress markers. And I will turn it over to Sue first. Thank you.
Thank you, Shapresa. I just noticed it says experts on there, and I think the slide needs modified. Maybe that meant Angie. But I am happy to share my experience with this, and I want to start with conversation about the SIA process in general. Something that really resonated for me with the way that the entire process is formed is the heavy emphasis on community engagement, and then this deep thinking around what strategies will we take to change the practice and behaviors of adults in the system. And so when we say we want kids to read more, we can't, or okay, we'll make PD. Well, making PD doesn't change the behaviors of the adults in the system unless it's very systematic. And I think those are conversations that resonate really strongly with educators and with leaders and with community. And it puts everybody on the same page. So I share that a little bit just to outline like the connection to outcomes, and Shapresa shared, and then Scott put in the link, but I was gonna do it also. When we all came together in, was that February or March? That March the first time, you know, it was pre-COVID because there were like 50 of us packed in a room with no physical distancing at the Oregon State Library. And it was a really diverse group. I didn't know what to expect. And so there were quite a few ODE staff, and having previously worked at ODE, it was exciting to see representation from a whole bunch of different departments at ODE in this conversation. And then district representation, ESD representation, and then organizations that aren't in the K-12 system who think deeply about educational equity. And there was diversity in the room by race, age, experience, you name it. And so, and then when we all introduced ourselves, I think it's important to know, like, equity came alive just in the introductions. And so I was excited personally to see that there's a group thinking this deeply about how to measure impact on a system and in education that was just super rooted in equity from the second that we started. And Scott and team really set that stage. And then Scott shared at that time this outcome mapping link. And it was this like aha moment for me to say, like, oh, that's what we're doing in this whole SIA process. And it provided the framework to put the pieces together. So when Scott typed into there, if you want to geek out on this stuff, there were a whole bunch of people in that room who like to geek out in this stuff, but I believe there's a whole bunch of people in education who are trying to do things different and not just measure with, like, you know, test scores at the end of the year, but really, how do you move the dial? And if you're one of those people, I recommend digging into the outcome mapping website. And just to name, outcome mapping is an approach to planning, monitoring, and evaluation that puts people at the center, defines outcomes in terms of changing behavior, and it helps measure contributions to the complex changes that are occurring throughout the system. And changing education is not easy, and measuring that change is even harder. And this is an approach to that. So, and then Shpressa shared where I forget what you called it, enabling conditions was added. I remember that moment where we were all sharing out from our work in individual groups and realized that, hey, we don't believe any change can happen until an equity lens is shared, because so many groups had shared that that was a core component of what needed to be in place in order to move the dial. And so it was, I want to name, like, the responsiveness of this process, that we came together, we shared our best thinking in small groups and then shared out and across groups. And then to see something that went against this great process emerge and actually make it into the final documentation is really a testament to how responsive it was. And continues to be. Even the framing of this conversation seems like it's still in draft form, and that these continued conversations are learning and to continue to define, and I really appreciate that. In terms of how this connects to, like, life changed a month later, and we still continued the process. There was a call where we got on and saw, like, okay, here's what the work, where it landed. Can you dig in and give feedback? And we did that, and in a virtual setting this time. But I reflected on that kind of over the last couple of days of, does this work matter now that we're all busy doing reopening, right? And just to see how many people are on this call, I think it does matter. And where it matters is, hey, we wrote these longitudinal performance growth targets with numbers that we won't even have for this year, right? So those quantitative metrics, like, literally don't matter right now, because in many cases they won't exist. And yet, if you look into the progress markers, that's the work that's actually happening in districts, and the thinking, hopefully, that's happening as we prioritize students that often get marginalized and left out and have the hardest time accessing our systems. When things like communications and equity lens and beliefs in students, and I don't have it open right now, so I'm going to make up some of them. But when those things are in place, turns out responding to crisis goes better. And I think that's what we need to be thinking about these progress markers as, is not this is the work we're actually engaging in and doing, and we should celebrate it and know that we're making a difference as we meet these metrics. And the true measurement is how well can you respond to crisis. And so if you feel like you're learning a lot in this current crisis mode, I encourage us to look at how that maps to these progress markers, and then where we can tighten up our own systems and our own behaviors inside those systems. Hopefully we'll have less crisis and chaos in the future, but when it comes, hopefully we'll be better prepared.
Great, thank you, Sue. Chris, can you advance to the next slide? And I would invite Angie to share her experience. Angie?
Hi, yes. So sorry you guys can't see me. I said I'm in the car. Angie Riola, I'm out here, ESD in Vail, Oregon. So clear the east side of the state if you're not familiar, even a different time zone. So I think I was invited to this, and please jump into questions, interrupt me anytime. When we started the process, I started with the SIP when the SSA came out and SIA, and talked to the talked to Brian and Tim, who'll probably bring this up later. We can merge that. That's great work. How can we also use some of that great work we've already done into the SSA applications? And in talking and thinking, there was a part, I think it was like part 5, I called it, and it asked, what kind of things came up in your discussions with community teachers and school districts? And when we're developing our SIPs, I asked each district, hey, anything you guys brainstorm within that, throw into that area. And so our districts over here, I have 11 school districts I work with. We did that, and then moving into the SIA pieces, they were able to take once they got community engagement, we could kind of go back and forth and look at various areas. So I'm gonna jump ahead a little bit, but looking at that, I think there's definitely value and use in going through those processes, especially community engagement. That was amazing around here, and all of my districts appreciated that and enjoyed it. When we look at the progress markers, the longitudinal performance growth goals are local metrics. For my districts, I literally have some districts that are so small, it's only asterisks in any of the 5 areas that we were able to use. And so started talking around to some of my districts, and I really appreciate ODE's work with this and working with me. I said, hey, what's some options? And they came up with that, and I'm grateful for that. So within that, some of the districts were able to use our own local progress. So we could still show progress, we could dig deep, we could look at areas that could use improvement, for lack of a better, we're making more robust in ways that could help the education of the students and the schools, but without the whole community knowing. Because I have a district of 2 kids literally, and so you would know what the progress markers were in those. So probably my piece in this, I'm guessing now as I'm listening, is the local metrics. And we have districts who are only K through 8, and they go to different counties for schools, for high school. Interesting situations over here. And so like 9th grade on track, high school graduation rates, those were hard to track. And so just giving some flexibility to some smaller schools or in unique situations, greatly appreciated. And then we just basically, it was a sit-down process. They were small groups, small schools, buildings, and just went through various processes to get to what we thought. So one was math and helping adults. Adults, it was very good. There's a lot of trust in the room. Adults will say, hey, I really struggle with this. And so we were looking at, with some of the funds, doing coaches and mentoring, etc., which is something post-COVID we can do. Once things kind of, loosen up and stuff, it's still things that are definitely feasible and the districts want. Even right now in the planning process, they've come to me and say, hey, we would still love to do some of the stuff if we're able to, whether it's virtual or other ways. They still want to go through with some of those plans, and I think that's wonderful, and we're trying to support them that way right now. So I don't know if there's more you wanted me to explain or elaborate on. Professor Scott or Tim or Brian?
I think that's great. Thank you so much, Sue, and thank you so much, Angie. if we continue to offer these workshops in the future, we'll definitely have opportunities to really kind of dive deeper into the progress markers and longitudinal performance growth targets. For today's purpose, I think we're just at the introducing the progress markers, sharing the experience of how they were developed, and then soliciting feedback from all of you. So the slide that is projected includes some examples, but in the document, you will see that we have provided 6 progress markers for each category, for each of the common metrics. You will see 3 expect to see progress markers and 3 would like to see progress markers. And we really invite you to take a closer look and also just provide feedback on whether they resonate with you and whether you can see applications of this approach, as I mentioned, beyond SIA. Next slide, please. So here is where we have provided the link to the progress markers document and to the feedback form. Thank you so much. And now I will turn it over to my colleague, Tim Boyd, that will lead the session on longitudinal performance growth targets development. Thank you.
Thanks, Shapresa. And first, just thanks to everyone who's joining us today. It's so great to see names and faces. I think in this virtual environment, some of this feels very matrixy, like is it real, is it not real? But it's just really great to see everybody right now. Kind of as I get started here, I'm mindful of time, so I'm gonna move pretty quickly, but I wanna engage the tension right now between what Sue was sharing as far as needing to change systems, change adult behaviors or behaviors of educators if we want to see outcomes change. And for a really long time, thank you, No Child Left Behind, we have been hyper-focused on outcome data, almost to a detriment of a lot of tenets of kind of what public education could and should be. And No Child Left Behind has helped us get better at addressing the inequities within our schools and our school districts and our communities. And so it's kind of a necessary component here, but given our current reality, this conversation around outcome data doesn't seem to be quite as important as really emphasizing supporting our students differently than we have in the past. So I'm gonna put that out there. It's a whole conversation for another month of opportunities, but I'm going to name it and kind of jump right in. So slide, please, Chris. SIA directs the department to collaborate with grant recipients to develop the longitudinal performance growth targets. The law is pretty clear that this was supposed to happen after applications were submitted. And so we were kind of working on processes to really develop this notion of co-development of the growth targets with plans to convene both school district, charter school, ESD staff, not only in an attempt to learn, but also to kind of expand capacity around the state to do this. As Scott has kind of framed it, it's the right amount of challenge, the right amount of support. The growth targets being the way that we would ultimately address kind of some of these accountability issues with what we're actually doing with the resources and how we're changing supports for students. And then COVID happened. And so as we kind of hit pause or are still trying to play catch up and address some of the questions that exist internally, we kind of turned our attention to ask the questions, so what are we going to do with this? How do we begin to review what has already been done in ways that set us up to better build the right supports for school districts and charter schools in order to engage in the development of these growth targets. As we looked at some of the draft targets that were submitted, we essentially came up with these 4 kind of guiding questions to know whether or not folks were on track or not on track. And they're pretty basic, they're pretty straightforward. Did the applicant include targets for the 5 common metrics? Did the applicant include gap closing metric for focal student groups? Are the targets reasonable? And then do the gap closing targets actually begin to close gaps? And so I think in the chat, Rachel has already included the overall guidance that was developed. I'm going to send off kind of the section 4 guidance of the evaluation framework. There's tons of resources in here to offer some really technical supports in developing this. We know that there are still questions that remain, and again, want to be able to get us to the Q&A part of this. But really kind of looking at and considering what is reasonable growth, what is average growth across the state, how do we push, what's good enough. We don't want to find ourselves back in that No Child Left Behind space of essentially needing to address exponential growth over time. It was well intended, but ultimately not tenable. And so how do we come alongside school districts and charter schools to learn better, to be more data savvy, but also understand kind of where we're headed with these things. Slide. So briefly, we're going to kind of walk through a few examples that were submitted. This is real data that came with some of the SIA applications. I'm going to briefly kind of walk through what we're seeing in these different presentations, and then be able to turn it over to colleagues in ESDs who are really boots on the ground working with school districts, school district leader, charter schools to do some of this work. So in this first slide, we've got a four-year cohort grad rate kind of target set up. We've also got the 5-year completion for a different school district. So these are 2 different submissions. As we dig in, looking at the 4-year, at first glance, you can see there in that left-hand column, the median or average for the district is a little bit higher than the state averages. As you move year over year, the baseline targets move at about 1% per year, which is a lot, depending on the size of the district. So one thing that's missing in these presentations are N size. We don't know how many students we're talking about. We don't know what the overall graduation rate is or the number of students. The stretch goals move at about 1.9% per year, so higher than the baseline. And then the gap closing targets are at about 2% per year. So when we go back to the 4 questions we developed, we can say yes to the latter 3 questions, that these particular targets do in fact have a measure for focal student groups. They begin to close the gaps, and they're reasonable kind of within some of the parameters that were set out in the guidance. For the next one, the 3rd grade reading, again, here's a different presentation of the data. What we see here is looking first at the focal student groups. We can see significant variances between the Hispanic student population, students from underserved races and ethnicities, and the group of students experiencing poverty. So this is one of the places that we really need to attend to when we look at the single focal student group target that's developed, and knowing that when you have gaps within gaps, a single target has the potential to mask those gaps or not be fully transparent in looking at how we're actually supporting our focal student groups, both specifically and then holistically. Again, the baseline targets move at about 1.9% per year. The stretch targets here are 3.7%, so that's a significant stretch. And the gap closing target does in fact begin to close the gaps for those our focal student groups at 3.5% per year. Conversations might need to happen with whether or not those targets are reasonable. Again, if it's too ambitious, are we setting out that right kind of challenge support conversation. If they're not ambitious enough, are we actually addressing the spirit of the law in supporting our equity commitments? Slide. For regular attenders, 9th grade on track. Again, the regular attenders here, it's relatively strong data. Baseline moves at about 0.1% per year. So as we're reviewing some of these, that might be a little low. We might kind of encourage the district to rethink that, ensure that we've got the right supports. But again, not knowing the end size with this particular school district, something that we would need to dig a little deeper into. The stretch targets, a little over 0.5% per year. And the gap closing targets do in fact close the gap. It's initially a 6% gap between our focal student groups and our baseline target. And then at the end of that 5-year window, it's down to about 4%. So on one hand, we'd say, yes, this kind of fits. But if we're, again, building that context and understanding a little more deeply what the numbers look like, we may have conversations there to say, can we be a little more ambitious? And again, this is where the emphasis or the need to co-develop as opposed to just review and approve targets kind of in a vacuum need to be elevated. It's a similar situation with the 9th grade on track data. Again, really strong data here, relatively speaking, when you've got 93% of students being reported to be on track. There is a gap between focal student groups, but even for focal student groups, that 84% is really strong. The baseline moves at about 0.9% per year. The stretch is 1.5%. So again, those are both reasonable measures. And then the gap closing, an initial gap at about 8.5% when we start, down to 3% after 5 years. So wanted to share kind of those examples that were actually submitted, and now kind of hear more from our colleagues in ESDs that we're working closely with school districts. And so I think Brian Bain from Northwest Regional ESD is next up to kind of walk us through some of those processes. We've also got Maddie Conning and Dr. Ella Taylor, who I think are going to accompany Brian in our next piece of conversation.
Sure. Thank you, Tim. Yeah, so I'm with Northwest Regional ESD. I actually started with Northwest Regional on January 6th. I just looked that up. And I was told as I came in the door that day that I had to explain what superintendents should do with their longitudinal growth performance targets by January 10th, the end of that week. So it was a deep dive into that piece of documentation that Tim shared. And I think the highlight of that entire thing was page 14. So go straight to that. That's where he lays out, or the team laid out, what growth has looked like for other districts, what the percentiles look like across the state. And it really helped to set the frame for where we were to go. I think there was a lot of interpretation that had to be done. I made some guesses on what I thought was being implied. And even as Shapress asked me to present today, I said, I'm not sure that what I did was right, but having seen the rubric Tim just shared, those are almost the exact same guidelines that we came up with. Are you showing growth? Are you closing the gaps? Are you not too ambitious? That sort of thing. So Chris, can you show the next slide? Hopefully.
Yep.
Oh, this was another one of Tim's slides. Go one more. There should be a picture of, oh, one more. Yes. So that Friday, I gave districts my best guess at what their data was going to be. Remember, at this time, we hadn't received from ODE the files. So I went back to the publicly available information, gathered as much information as we could, and stuck it into this format. This has evolved over time. This is kind of the most recent one. But down the bottom left, you can see that I've included things like what does top growth look like for a district, and what does the percentiles look like. This came straight out of that page 14. And I sat down with those superintendents on that Friday, and I gave them a blank piece of graph paper. And I said, let's start plotting your data. let's draw this in here. So they drew in each data point for their all students. And then we went ahead and drew what does a growth rate of 3.8 look like. And we drew that line. And I said to them, that's what the top 10% of districts have ever done. Don't go above that, right? And we drew a line straight across and we said, here's your baseline. Don't go below your baseline. You're not showing any growth if you set a goal below that. So we kind of did that sort of process. And if you go to the next slide, please, Chris. That's essentially what this slide is showing. We had them do it by hand, but this is taking their all students group is the blue line there, drawing it out, and then we picked the starting point. It's actually a little bit lower because you can see this district had a lot of growth that last year. We drew out dotted lines that said, okay, this could be where we go to. Oh, thank you so much. Where we go to, that would be maybe where we're aiming for with our stretch goal. And then we drew out the baseline and we set 2 goals within there. So it was all in the guidance. If you really read and interpreted, it was kind of in there. Some issues that we ran into was that, and you saw it on the previous slide, I called it combined disadvantage because that's what's in some of the data files, also known as underserved or underrepresented. Even that language is deficit based. So I think there's some opportunity to change there. But that data file or that line isn't available for every population. And it would be nice to have consistency as we're doing this process. So that's kind of what we did. Ultimately, and maybe I'm jumping to the end, but ultimately what we tended to find was that if we were in a percentile, say we are currently in the bottom 50%, you can see in that yellow zone for our all students, kind of where our starting point is, we aim to move up a percentile group or up 2 percentile groups for our stretch. And that seemed to work in most cases. Sometimes it was sitting down and taking another look at it to make sure that's what made the most sense, but we could use that as a starting point. And that was something I came up with after going through about, 16 of my 20 districts. So we've realized, wow, we could just shortcut this if we just said, what would it take to get to the next percentile group? And then I think Ella Taylor and took this and revised it some in their ESD. So I believe I'm to turn it over to her now. So.
Thanks, Brian. I appreciate that. As Brian said, we are eternally grateful to he and Northwest Regional ESD, as well as ODE, for the guidance that was provided, and Brian for sort of launching this amazing spreadsheet and template. I'm fortunate at the Willamette ESD to not be a singleton. I have a group of data analysts and program evaluators. And so we were able to work with each of our 21 districts to look at the 5 performance growth targets, as well as any other local metrics that they wanted to explore. But basically what we did is as Brian did, we went to the publicly available data and we pulled that down. So of course we didn't get the small ends, and we also have some small districts which we had to work with differently around this. But for that publicly available data, we used, just as Brian said, we looked for combined disadvantage, which is what it's called in the data, and then plotted out all of the groups, quite honestly. We also looked at how districts might move between percentile bands, which is what the colors represent, as Brian mentioned. We also really looked at what the guidance had said within ODE about being really thoughtful about that baseline. And so for us, it was real critical as we talked to our districts that they really wanted to set a baseline that allowed them to say, this is absolutely the bottom. Right? We're not going to go below this. This is our goal, not to go below this baseline. And so we took ODE's guidance around either using the 3-year average or the 18-19 percentile, and whichever one was lower. And so we used that and we just took it out all the way across the 5 years and said, that's your baseline. So it allowed districts to say, okay, that's absolutely where we don't want to go below that. And for many of our districts who, you know, might have been on a downward trajectory, that was pretty critical. Because you can start to see for districts, this gets a little scary also based on what Tim had said, with some, you know, nightmarish connections back to No Child Left Behind. However, we also wanted to work with districts in saying, here's what the top 10% of the districts who are in the top 10%, here's what their growth is. And so we looked at that and we plotted that out as well. For several of our districts, that was growth that just wasn't, they did not feel comfortable with. There was no way they were going to go with that. And of course, as we know, once you start to put some numbers out, people start looking at those numbers and then they want to know, why aren't you hitting those numbers? And so we wanted to be really thoughtful, and our districts wanted to be really thoughtful about that as well. For others of our districts, the growth would of course taken them over 100%. And that wasn't going to make sense either. So we really started to look at what's going to make sense for your district. Where are you? What aligns with that? For us, it became, as I know it did for everyone else, a conversation. And many times that conversation, particularly around the stretch targets, was, well, we're going to emphasize X, right? We're going to emphasize a new instructional strategy. We're going to emphasize a new curricular strategy. We just need time for it to take. And so we would start with a lower growth on the stretch target and then move into a much larger, generally around whatever the top 10% was. And so that allowed that growth to occur. And again, going back to the ODE guidance, which we greatly appreciated, examples were provided that did exactly that. So we felt very comfortable doing that kind of an analysis to say, you know, it doesn't have to be the same percentage all the way across. Things are going to happen. And so that allowed us to be able to look at what we felt and the districts felt were realistic stretch targets, realistic baseline. When we started to get into the focal student groups, of course, we used combined disadvantage where it was available. However, as Brian said, it wasn't always available. In that sense, we would try to look at what's the next largest population that you have. And often that was economically disadvantaged or those on free and reduced meals. And then we would end up using that as the focal population. In essence, you're looking to say, how are you going to increase the largest number, all of the students rising to the baseline minimally. I think that worked well, except for when you have a district that's a SEEP district or that the entire district is designated as on free and reduced meals. And then we'd have to look for the next largest population, which often was Latino or Hispanic. And so that's, I mean, those are all of the variables that we worked with districts around to really think through how to make this meaningful. And very much appreciate that guidance to say this needed to be, this will be, of course, co-developed, but also it helped districts understand their data and understand what drove that data. And so I think for us in our conversation, that was really helpful. And of course, many kudos to ODE for moving us down that path. And I know Maddie has a different example, so I will turn it over to her.
Hi, I'm Maddie Koenig with Intermountain ESD. We serve Morrow, Umatilla, Union, and Baker counties, and I'm sitting in LaGrande, Oregon today. So a main part of when we really started looking at the guidance around the growth targets was really making it meaningful and so that it would be impactful in the decision making. So a lot of effort was put into kind of developing the methodology of how we were going to approach developing the targets. So one piece that I put together was just kind of a general guidance of this is how we can approach our baseline, this is how we're going to approach our stretch targets, and then our combined focal gap closing targets. And then if we go to the next slide, we did just a very generic kind of template. And one piece that our districts found to be really helpful was for each of the metrics up at the top, we included what was considered that significant growth, just so that would guide our discussions around, is it reasonable? And then what percentile is considered at the 50th percentile. And that also guided our conversations of, well, where do we land in relationship to other school districts around the state? What percentile are we falling in? And where would we like to end? Sorry, my voice is kind of going in and out. So then when we sat down with our school districts, we focused on looking at our suppressed and unsuppressed data and really having those deep conversations about our students. And one piece that I found really interesting is when we were looking at our unsuppressed data, many of our school districts are very small. So we would maybe have 2 or 3 students in a focal population. And then looking at, you know, how that would change each year. So then maybe one year there was only 1 student in that focal population. And then maybe we'd have 5 students in the focal population a different year. But tracking, even though they had low N sizes, still tracking those groups' performance and seeing what efforts we're doing even with our low N size. And so since with the low N size, we decided that we didn't want to include that data just because it would skew a little bit because it varied so much from year to year. But it was really important to have those conversations because we didn't want to exclude those groups even with the low N size, that it was really important to have those deep conversations about, even though it's not represented in this data set, what are we doing in our plans to help those groups of students? So those conversations were really valuable. But like Ella was talking, our baseline, we really looked at where we were falling for percentile. If we were 50th percentile, we really focused on that as the baseline. We have to maintain that. In our efforts, that is absolutely the baseline. For some school districts, they were below the 50th percentile. So we looked at what efforts would it take for our school districts in line with our SIA plans to get to a baseline that would be at least at the 50th percentile. So that was sort of our goal for the baseline. Then we looked at our stretch target and we related that to the percentile in relation to other school districts of where would we like to end with that stretch target. And we really used the growth for the top 10% school districts to kind of base, is that reasonable? It was also really important for our really small school districts to look at that historical data, because even with our small school districts, we'd see a swing of really high percentile in a group of students and then a really low percentile. And so looking at that historical data and then looking at it, is this percentile actually reasonable based on if this is on a 5-year average? Because we would look and maybe the first 2 years in the historical data had a really high swing. And then as we progress through the years in historical data, we're gonna lose those 2 cohorts of students, and then our overall percentage is going to be impacted. So really looking at, is that reasonable over the average? Then we moved into the combined focal groups. What we did is we used our suppressed data to really look at the groups of students that had larger than the N size that was suppressed. And then we identified within those groups, either the groups of students that were not at our all students or were not at the state average. And that really guided which groups were included and which groups were not. We have 5 minority majority school districts within our region, and many of those with our Hispanic students were outperforming the all student and even the state average. And so we had some really good conversations around what efforts are we doing for those students, and then looking at our other focal populations. So in those cases, our Latino students were not included in our combined focal populations because they were already outperforming the all student, and then they were outperforming the state average. So that we felt like that was also something to really celebrate when diving deeper into our data. But so we included all the focal groups that were at the district or the state, and then did a combined average, and then we had that as kind of our baseline. And then we looked at that in relationship to, well, what is our goal for the baseline for the whole district? What is that in relationship to our end for our stretch target? And where do we need to land in relationship to really actually close the gaps? And then sometimes we would, end up with like 5%, which is just an outrageous number to actually move groups of students. So then we had to kind of back down our conversations of what is actually reasonable when we're looking at our groups of students, what is reasonable based on number of students in our focal groups, and then in relationship to our efforts in our SIA plan. So I think overall, it really drove some great conversations about the efforts that we have designed in the SIA plans, but it also really drove it more than just the numbers in relationship to growth. It really drove it down to the groups of students that our plans are going to impact and the efforts that need to be done to move those percentages. So that is all I have to share. Thank you.
Great. Chris, can you take us to the next slide? Now we're going to hear from Leah Thorpe and Shauna Moran, who've also been kind of working through some of the review of the draft targets that have been submitted, and really kind of elevating some of the challenges or misunderstanding that have been at some point like run with moving forward. And so we're trying to dispel some of the gaps there or offer some counterexamples. So Leah.
Thank you. Can you go to the next slide, please? So if you see data here that looks real familiar to you, don't fret. This is actual information that was submitted, but they're representing common things that we saw. And so don't worry if this looks real up your alley. So one of the things that we saw that we kind of made us take pause is what is really attainable here. We love that school districts were being very aspirational, but at the same time, we also needed to think about what is realistic. And so an example of perhaps a little too lofty of a target is shown in this one. We know that third grade reading for those top 10% have that growth of about 3.7%. And you can see here that for the baseline target for this district, they were looking at 8, 10, and 14% growth. And I hope they can do it, but we know that historically that kind of growth hasn't quite been achievable. And so that would be an example of an unrealistic target that we would probably want to scale back a little bit in order to be more attainable. Next slide, please. This slide here shows one of the things that we were looking at is for those gap closing targets, were they actually closing gaps? And so for that focal student group, between that and all students, did that get smaller as time went on? And so you can see in this example with attendance that it started out with a difference of 1.7%, and then it increased over time to 3.3%. And so even though their baseline targets were increasing and their gap closing targets were increasing, which is what we hope and expect to see, the gap actually ended up getting larger over time. And so this would be something that we'd want to really focus on and modify to make sure that we're actually closing that target. The next thing that we saw was some folks were giving us targets for closing that gap for each and every student group that was one of those focal student populations. And so we recognized that maybe the guidance wasn't as clear on this as it could have been. And so what we were really looking for is for all of those focal student groups to be included in one target and one goal. And so while individual school districts may have goals for each of those different groups, we were looking for in this application to just have those all combined into one, so that then it's a little more little bit more reasonable to track and be able to tell when a school district is meeting those or not meeting those. And so here we see all of them listed here, but we'd really just prefer to see those as one group altogether. Next slide. And then another one that we saw was that some folks chose to just focus on one group within that focal group. So there were a number of different student populations that we really want, that are historically underserved, that we really want to make sure are the focus of these goals. And so for some examples, we saw just one of those groups was included. And so we'd really like to see all of those put together again into one focal group for setting those goal targets. And I think next slide on to Shauna.
Thanks, Leah. I've just got two examples here, and they'll go really quickly. And I'm just going to go ahead and send again section 4 of the guidance, because section 4 of the guidance is particularly helpful when looking at defining the baseline target, which is defined in our guidance as the minimum level of growth that a district would be satisfied with over the course of the 5 years. So in this example, for 5-year completion, we again see growth achieved by the top 10% of districts at about 2.3%. And then we also see what the, starting from the top 10% down to the bottom 10%, how districts are falling in that 5-year completion rate. So on the bottom left, we're looking specifically here at a flat baseline target example. And in this example, it's 92.4% across all 5 years. 92.4% is pretty high achievement in the 5-year completion, putting this district in about that top 25%. So maybe that is an appropriate flat baseline target in this particular context. The other example on the bottom right is a flat baseline target that is at 65.8% across all 5 years. And that's probably a bit lower minimum growth that the district would hope to see over the course of those 5 years. It's maintaining that district performance for this area in the bottom 10%. So this would be an example where we wouldn't want to see a flat baseline rate over the 5 years. Okay, next slide. And this is something that we saw a few examples of. And in this example, we see the district took the opportunity to add some local optional metrics for 5th grade reading and 8th grade math, which is great. We encourage that. But in this particular example, they left off one of the metrics. I think it was the attendance. And so that one was one of the 5 required metrics. So we would just need to have that one added back in. And that is the end of my section.
Great. Thank you, Shauna and Leah. Krista, the next slide, and if you're tracking in the chat, I think Brian and Ella have already begun to kind of elevate some of the lessons learned, but if Maddie, Brian, Ella wanted to share any more, kind of observations from your support with school districts, or some of our other colleagues as you've kind of engaged in some of the process, we'll kind of open it up here, and then I think this will kind of organically take us into the Q&A portion of this, so you can really use the chat to fire out your questions, or this will be fun to awkwardly try to unmute all at the same time and jockey for kind of position and comment.
So Brian, Ella, or Maddie, if you have anything more, just jump in and offer. Otherwise, we'll open the Q&A. And again, just unmute and we'll go like family room style. And like, you can also use the chat. And I'll just toss a couple things that might, Maddie, Ella, or Brian, but really anyone could answer that are things I think we're curious about. It's way bigger than we have for 15 minutes, but they might seed a future conversation. So like, are you seeing all the work that was done, knowing the context has changed? Like, are any of you finding it being useful now? And if so, how? Like, we want to learn and listen about that. Did any of you, as you were developing, I think, Dr. Taylor, you spoke a little bit about this, but did you see districts factoring context into their growth target setting or their metrics? Changes in leadership, changes in new curricular or program development? Could you see maps to context versus just like math? So like that's interesting to us. Lessons or gaps around where the metrics and things move, but maybe are different than the budget. We've had some discussion around like the metrics go like this, but the outcomes and strategies and budget go like that, and they're not actually talking to each other. And some of that, to be candid, is the legislation is not quite requiring all of the glue. But if we're trying to get towards coherence, so curious about what you learned about that, or the kind of conversations that happened around alignment between budget, investment, plan and program, even tiered planning. And
do you want us to jump in and take them one at a time? Because that was a lot of questions.
Yeah, I just wanted to see that you can take any one of them. You don't answer all of them. You don't even need to respond. I just wanted to plant a few that everyone could think about to kind of prime the pump.
So the common metrics that we're looking at, for anyone who's been around for a while, I think they're very familiar because they kind of were developed during the time of achievement compacts. Many of them. And so it's stuff that people are aware of, they know it's out there, but I think narrowing it down to a focus group and setting key goals on it and making that relevant is important. It kind of reemphasized the focus on them. And I am seeing those already coming out as our ESD works on a new strategic plan. We have called those out as these are the 5 that we are for sure going to move, as well as some other things, and support. I think there was one in the middle there I missed. Setting the targets and goals in particular. As the ESD, we were going to set these for our own organization. I used your process, your guidelines around what's too ambitious and so on. And same thing I saw with districts, if you set them at what's reasonable and attainable, it doesn't feel ambitious enough. A lot of times we want to set stretch goals more than we want to set that baseline goal, if you will, where we're going. And so I set them using some of your guidance and they got kicked higher. They got kicked up because, they're ambitious. We want to reach those.
There's an interesting spot here, which I know in some of the workshops with superintendents, trying to teach, and I wrote a note during today's workshop, like why attainable, right? And it really gets into thinking about like improvement and change science around, we have a political need and no one wants to look at numbers and go like that's not adequate. And you say, well, you don't have high enough expectations. And yet what happens is we put false numbers that we can't actually reach, and then create a deterioration in both motivation for teachers and public trust because we don't track to those attainable numbers. And so we want to be motivated by one way ahead, but we don't actually get sufficient traction or knowledge about what gets us that traction. And that diminishes, right? And we have a couple decades worth of literature that would affirm that that's what's been going on. But you're right, like when you actually start to track it at what are more realistic numbers and some accountability to those numbers, which part of this law builds in this infrastructure, which is why that baseline rate that Shauna just talked about is really important. Suddenly it can feel like, wow, we're lowballing this thing, and it's not actually true. You're just setting up a structure that's in the land of, doability. And then that also creates a different accountability because suddenly you can't go, well, our numbers we set them too high and now we can't reach them because they're not realistic. It's like, no, actually we set them realistic, but now we have to be held accountable to meeting them. So there's a whole wheel around that.
So I
And
mentioned
Scott,
earlier.
I think that's a really important point. Sorry, Brian. But it's that piece that says they do have to be realistic, right? And so the conversations we had, and especially around baseline, I mean, there are districts, and we all know this occurs, in which they are on a downward trajectory. So just maintaining a flat baseline is the best that they can do, right? And I don't mean that pejoratively in any way. It's just literally that's what they're going to focus on, and they feel that they can hold themselves accountable to that, and then really work on where is that stretch. And so I think that's a really important point, and why the rationale, including some rationale with the targets, I think is going to be really critical. And in that, I think one of the best things that came out of this for those of us who really sat down with our districts and worked through this process was having very meaningful conversations about not only data, but what they were going to implement to change that data. And so that's when we started getting into, well, you know, nothing's going to happen year one, or it's going to be really minimal, but give us a couple of years and we should anticipate to see much greater increase. Or we're implementing a new K-2 curriculum. So when our kindergartners get to third grade, which is probably year 4, we should see tremendous growth, right? So there was a real structure and a real conversation about that. And I thought that was particularly important, and also then connects to progress markers, right? Because then you've got the ability to say, okay, let's look at what else is happening during these years as you're waiting to get up to your, more aggressive stretch targets. So I thought that was a good way of linking those processes together.
When we were focusing conversations on what was attainable, we were looking at the percentage and kind of building this percentage out, and then working backwards of, well, what does that actually mean? When we're really talking about students and not just a percentage, how many more students does this mean in third grade that we're going to get to meet or exceed? And then really talking about, is that attainable? When we have a full third grade class and there's only 20 students, if you're talking about getting 3 more to pass, is that really attainable? Maybe it is in the implementation of what we're planning. Or when we're talking about a really high percentage of 4-year graduation, it might be a very, very small percentage growth each year, because in reality that is only 1 student over the 5 years, but it's going to put us at 99.8%. And so really having those conversations of what does that percentage mean in relationship to students, and then in relationship to our plan efforts. And I think that's where it really brought the questions and the conversation focus to what is attainable in our plans.
I'm tracking our time, and I want to address Sandy's very important question from the chat, and then we'll see if Rachel or Professor or Tim want to add any thing as kind of seeds for more, and then we'll want to get your feedback rapidly just around, is having more of this kind of conversation valuable? It feels like it to us. I know we sat for a while, and this will tie a little bit, Sandy, to your answer, which is like, how do we nourish this conversation while we're sitting in a little bit of limbo from a structural standpoint in a couple different ways. So Sandy asked in the chat, sorry if I missed this, but what will we use for setting targets without the 1920 data sets? In this case, she referenced the SBAC and third grade reading, but it's actually true for almost all the types of data collections for this immediate next year. So there's a couple of ways we're thinking about that, and then some caveats, right? So the caveats are we're in the middle of responding to COVID-19. There's lots of response, and different states, including ours, are evaluating assessment options and structures. And while those things sit in limbo, it actually makes more important the progress marker framework. If the SIA goes forward, or even if it doesn't, we'd hope that the progress marker work might be helpful to schools and districts, because it allows us to say, in the absence of those high-level metrics and the ways they move, what are the kinds of changes that we think lead to those things, which are more actionable even without the kind of data sets. And so you'll get a follow-up email that kind of fully launches that whole document, and we'll be really interested in folks' feedback. Our design plan, what was in the original guidance, was we'd use the whole year, we called it a foundational year, to basically workshop those progress markers and make any adjustments at the end of this year. And then we'd kind of lock them in along with growth targets for 4 years. We're obviously in a period of recalibration and adjustment with that. We also don't know if the SIA will get funded at some level partially or not. So we're in some holding pattern around all those things. So the short answer, not so short answer to your question, Sandy, is you're going to want to look at your own local metrics. You're going to look at progress markers, and essentially you're not going to have like this immediate last year's data to work with, but that doesn't mean there aren't valuable things to be able to think about or track. And I see that Brian responded as well. The one other thing I wanted to share as a closing question that can seed future dialogue was around disaggregated data and the unified gap closing targets. One of the choices we made, kind of hard, many-houred conversation, was this idea that you would plot all the disaggregated data in the baseline, but we'd use this unified gap closing target, which the state data calls combined underserved. I don't love that language, but I know that that's what people refer to it as. But wanting to build some through line accountability, which has some puzzles in it. What I'm curious for future, we won't have time now, is like, did that combination of those two things actually help the right kinds of conversations happen from your perspective around the data, or did it mask it? Because like one of the big worries was this would either unlock some real accountability and some important conversations, or it would detract and mask. And so we're really curious how that's played out on the ground for all of you. I'm going to make space for Shapressa and Rachel, Tim, other folks on the team, if you have any kind of closing questions or thank yous to offer, and we'll move ourselves to a close. And I'll just offer like deep recognition and gratitude. Our big goal was to honor all the work that's been done. We're very clear, very humbled as a team by what we've received in terms of the applications and the depth of work. And you could really sense that on this call in the ways that people described what they did to support districts. So we're really clear about that and wanted to find a way to honor and recognize and see what learning we could get out of this, and want to know if this kind of thing is useful even as we're in some limbo. So that's it for me. And then Shapressa or Rachel, anybody else on the team want to offer any closing thoughts?
I'll just start with a huge thank you to everybody. Your being here right now is just clear evidence commitment to really changing conversation around how we're supporting our students, specifically our students of color, students learning English, students who have been neglected by our systems. So thanks for that. And as we've been saying for a while, we're still unlearning a lot of what No Child Left Behind has conditioned us to think about with regards to data and outcome data. And I think many folks have emphasized this, but like we really need to focus on what's actually happening in our classrooms and allow that to drive the conversation, not the fixing of the data or changing of the data. So, as we enter in this period of not having this big blunt instrument that we, and I say we, I mean like a state has kind of relied upon, like let's get nuanced, let's get nimble, let's find more refined measures that are valid, reliable, disaggregatable to ensure that we are doing right by our students. And let's start telling a different story. But thank you all for your commitment and for continuing to teach us as well. I think that's a huge feedback loop that we value strongly.
Thank you, Tim. And I would also like to offer deep appreciation to all of those who helped us develop and offer this workshop. So the offering of this workshop would have not been possible without the hard work of almost everybody in the Office of Education, Innovation and Improvement, with the support from ESDs and other partners that I can't mention all the names right now, but we would like to see more of these collaborative efforts unfolding in the future, and would greatly appreciate your feedback on the workshop. Was it helpful? Should we offer a series of similar workshops in the future? And we also apologize because we might not be able to answer all the questions that were provided in the chat function, but my colleagues are keeping track of the questions and will do the best we can to address the questions as we send out the SIA weekly updates. So stay tuned, and thank you very much for taking time out of your busy schedules to attend this workshop. Thank you.